Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining today. Let's start with a question. I think there's been a lot of conversation around, obviously, this event is called Converge, about AI and crypto coming together. But let's move towards just AI more specifically. How does increased decentralization, not necessarily relating to crypto, actually affect the trajectory of how AI is going to develop?
Sure. So we think about decentralization specifically for AI as an infrastructure problem. So there's a lot of resources that sit underneath AI and the creation of AI models that currently are just very hard to access. And the kind of rush in the market, and the centralized market at least so far, has been to capture those resources so that you could make money and profit off owning them essentially. The problem with that is it creates an ecosystem where competition is much lower. So when it comes to actual applications that can be solved by AI, there's tons of people in the world that could be applying a new enabling technology to a problem that they see close to them. AI can be used for so many problems within the kind of technological and just knowledge space, but people can't actually apply those solutions because they can't get access to the resources. So what we think happens ultimately once we get more of those resources built in a decentralized way is far more competition at the application level for using AI to just change the way we all interact with technology. That kind of rich competition leads to products that a centralized company might have not even thought of. They don't have the exposure to a certain market or the understanding of a certain problem or the agility to quickly iterate on a new product, but startups, individuals do, and they could be doing that with AI right now, but they're limited by those resource constraints. So that's the biggest change we think happens, is that great improvement in competition, which leads to much richer ecosystems for consumers, essentially.
So what I'm hearing is that the increased accessibility is going to really lead to diversification, which will lead to greater competition, and then that kind of cycle will continue to grow. But right now, I am seeing a lot of these products like decentralized compute or like AI agents. We had a couple of panels where all these founders were wonderful, but I don't know the difference between any of them. Are we going to start seeing greater differentiation, or what's going to happen with that?
Yeah, I think we are going to see greater differentiation. I think the reason a lot of the projects look the same right now is that the projects are talking about longer term visions for the world that they want to achieve, but we're still very early in most startups and projects' life cycles. So they're still building the seeds of what that is going to be, and every project will have a different view of how to achieve that vision. So our view is there isn't really competition at this stage because everyone's talking about a shared vision, which it does end up quite similar, but everyone's going to go down a completely different path. Like if you think about a startup, every startup goes through many, many pivot points. They originally try and address a problem or a space of problems. They try some things out, and then they iterate based on the feedback that they get. And every single project here is going to do that. So I think at this stage right now, we're more talking about this kind of shared view of the world that we all have that's years down the line. It's good to talk about that because it inspires other people to build towards that vision. It's not something that one single company is going to be able to achieve. But at some point further down the line, we'll see that those companies have gone in different directions and filled different niches and gaps that they've seen as they've gone. So yeah, I think we'll go through a period of, you could call it hype, you could call it just excitement around a shared vision, and then we'll probably go through a period of kind of deep building. And then when we come out of that, we'll have more of the seeds of the resources underneath for people to build things downstream. And I think that's when it's going to get really exciting. I'd probably split the projects that we see right now into the kind of low-level infrastructure category. So decentralized compute is a good example of that. People have seen constraints within the market for compute, and they're alleviating them in different ways. But then if you move over to the agent side, that's much more application-based. It's saying, what do we actually think can happen once decentralized compute exists, decentralized data exists, once we're doing federated learning across all of our devices, etc. Those projects look a lot more like proofs of concept. They're examples of what this future could be. And I think we'll cycle through a few of those where it will seem like there isn't a core use case underneath it because people are fundamentally experimenting. They're trying things out. And from that, we learn, similar to how we kind of read science fiction. A lot of the time, it's just an idea of the world that isn't achievable right now. Then when we look back at the history of science fiction, we see that a lot of those predictions ended up coming true. So it's worthwhile doing that process.
So I wonder from the product development standpoint, throughout this week, I hear like the one of the conversations that keeps coming up is about UX, right? And how horrible UX is across Web3, and how the greatest barrier to a lot of the adoption is just UX. I don't know why people just don't hire more UX designers, but maybe it's the attitude, right, towards what UX is, and what AI has changed a lot in Web 2 is transformed the UX landscape, right? So how do you think that it's going to interact with like Web 3 interfaces and UX?
Yeah, I think Web 3 has had a kind of rough history with UX. I think predominantly because Web 3 is fundamentally infrastructure most of the time. It's starting with a technology and creating that technology out in the world, but it's not starting with the problem that the user has. It's kind of coming from the technology to the user, and in typical style of anyone who's particularly technical, you put them in front of a user and say build them an interface, and they typically just expose the technology to the user in the simplest way, which from the user's perspective is typically not the nicest way to interact with it at all. You can directly give them access to API calls and things, but many users don't have no idea what that is. For a technical person, that is probably the best way to interact with it, but it's not kind of empathizing with the user. I think that is just intrinsic to being early with infrastructure. You are going to build in that technological way. I think what we need is people building directly from the other side. So people seeing a problem, trying to solve that problem, and realizing that, hey, there's a set of technologies here that didn't exist a few years ago that I can now use to solve this problem in a different way. But it's unlikely to ever come from the infrastructure builders themselves, realistically. So us expecting those like deeply technical foundational protocols to go all the way to the user and build fantastic UX for a consumer is unrealistic. What we're going to see is them build closer to the developers, and then developers come from the other side, deeply understanding the user and building UX for the user. The interesting bit with AI is when you throw that in is the AI itself can do that understanding of the user. So the chat interfaces we've got, I think they're very naive ways to interact with model parameter space, essentially. And there's many richer ways we can do it, but what they are is as close to the user as possible. They make interacting with a machine the same, theoretically, as interacting with a human, which could be the closest we could possibly get to a native interface for a human. You can go deeper than a chat interface with UX and create a better experience if you just abstract away the chat style interface, but maintain the on-demand generated UX itself. So everybody here gets a different UI when they visit a website. They get a UI that's based on some of the information they're bringing, some of the context and bias that they're coming with, gives them an entirely different interface to interact with. We can't do that right now in a kind of imperative rule-based system because the complexity would explode. But if we put a machine learning model in the middle, we can do that. It's going to be probabilistic. It's not going to be right 100% of the time, but it's going to be a much more natural way to interact with technology for a human, because it's going to be much more similar to interacting with a person, which is probabilistic. We got used to determinism in our human-computer interactions, but if you kind of look back through the entirety of history, we only used that for a short period of time. Like, computers haven't been around that long. We realized we had to be very imperative with them, but that might be over now. We might be actually just moving to probabilistic interaction. So instead of us saying, hey, we're gonna have to get used to this whole new way of interacting with computers, actually we just have to forget this short-lived way that we had to interact with them, and we go back to a more natural human interaction, but with machines.
That is a really, between meeting a new person versus, with a family member or a professional contact, we are very dynamic and we respond right based on the information that we're given. And it makes total sense to me that a web page or a program or a programming language or something should do the same for us as well. So last question. I think we talked a lot about we're at a really exciting time. We're at a precipice. There's going to be a lot of changes that are going to happen if they have not already. What are some of the risks that you're most worried about? And if we were to look forward 100 years and go back and say, here's the post-mortem, what would that look like to you?
Yeah, I think the biggest risk I see is as accidentally overhyping and getting too excited too soon about a foundational technology, and then accidentally delaying that because of that cycle. So speculation, I think, speculation is good in the sense that it allows us to fund work and projects that wouldn't have existed otherwise. It allows us as kind of humanity to experiment out in the world. But when taken too far, I think that leads to an explosion of growth and then a big chasm of disillusionment. And if we keep doing that cycle too kind of too high and too deep, we generally just expand all of the timelines for us to get to the future that I think realistically we all share as a vision. So the biggest danger, I think, is accidentally just delaying human progress and not having these foundational technologies that will make the world generally better as early as we can possibly have them. That's probably on the kind of Web3 decentralization side. On the centralization side, which I think the Web3 decentralization side caveats the point I'm about to make, so it's the solution. But on the centralized side, I think that drive for companies to capture some value from some core resources leads to certain things like regulatory capture that I think delay those timelines even further. And that's a huge danger for the world because it leads to delayed timelines, but it also leads to enormous biases baked into foundational technologies for humanity. A little bit like how when social media appeared, we didn't really understand what it was. It allowed us all to communicate in this amazing decentralized way where before we weren't able to communicate against such long distances with such shared context. We weren't able to share so much about ourselves to each other, but we didn't realize that that was going to get captured by basically one company, if not a handful of companies. I think if most people look back now, they say actually that probably would have been better if there was more competition within that market. We're at that same juncture right now with AI as a foundational technology, and we essentially have those two paths available to us. I think I'm preaching to the converted in here with the message that I think decentralized foundational technologies take us away from that path, but it's still a danger that the centralized companies can do the regulatory capture and can, using the social governance systems that we have in the world as humans, stop us from being able to achieve that by limiting technology rather than limiting the actions of people, which is typically how kind of social governance is actually enacted at the application level, not at the technology level.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Ben.